Venezuela is going through a severe economic crisis, and the government efforts to derail a recall referendum are increasing the risks of destabilizing protests. Venezuela has the world's proven largest oil reserves, but oil production has systematically been declining in the last year. The country's economy is already in recession, and the economy is expected to contract at least 9.2%. Shortages of food, basic goods, especially medicines, continue intensifying, along with water rationing schemes, shortages of water supplies, and more frequent electricity blackouts. Now, the government response to the opposition efforts to propose a recall referendum to early terminate incumbent President Maduro's mandate has been leading to more intense anti-government protests in the streets, and anxieties among the population are leading to events of looting. Now, the timing for a recall referendum is fundamental here, because if a recall referendum takes place within the next year, and specifically before January 2017, then elections need to take place within 30 days according to the Constitution. Now, if a recall referendum does not take place this year, and specifically before January 2017, then the vice president is, according to the Constitution, the one which needs to conclude the mandate. And this is incumbent President Maduro, choice of vice president, because the president is free to appoint and remove the vice president. Meanwhile, the government, which controls the Supreme Court, has been sidelining the opposition-controlled National Assembly. The opposition controls 2/3 majority in the National Assembly after a landslide victory in December's parliamentary elections. As the economy continues deteriorating, so will the political and security risks on the ground. So far, the recall referendum has been serving as a relief valve to the current economic crisis and intense shortages. But the government efforts to derail it are increasing the risk that social discontent in the streets can turn into political violence. We expect more frequent events of looting of supermarkets, pharmacies, and food retail stores, and more frequent anti-government protests, demanding a recall referendum or a better quality of services. Now, the risk is that protests in the form of looting and anti-government protests in the street in the form of roadblocks could escalate beyond the capacity of security forces to contain them. If that is the case, we could see the military intervening indirectly, forcing either a recall referendum or indeed the resignation of incumbent President Maduro. Now, as protests escalate and become more widespread, the risk is that the government will respond strongly. The last time this happened, there were at least 43 people killed in 2014. There were arbitrary detentions, human rights violations, and very well documented cases of torture. And that is the risk, again, that members of civil society are facing if they turn to the streets to push for a recall referendum or respond to anxieties over food and basic good shortages. Overall, we're going to continue seeing a trend of the opposition strengthening with the government weakening. The opposition will continue gaining ground while Maduro's brand of Chavismo will continue losing ground. As protests escalate and the economy deteriorates further, shortages intensify, and we see more strong anti-government protests and more events of looting, the armed forces are also expected to assume a more institutional role, and the high military command might gradually start withdrawing support for the government. So the key indicators of changing risk environment will be the economy and shortages. The government is not sending any signal that is changing the direction of the economy, so we would expect that the economy will continue deteriorating and shortages intensifying. The magnitude and scale of protests, and whether these take the form of looting and converge with anti-government protests demanding better public services and a recall referendum, and whether they reach the scale of the 1989 Caracazo event and military support. After more than 16 years of Chavismo, the armed forces remain the only institution in place with the power, along with the National Assembly, to put pressure to the different institutions to obtain specific outcomes. And the armed forces will continue playing a key role behind the scenes.